You ever watch the news, see a conflict break out, and just wonder, what really happened there? What was the final push that sent a nation over the edge? It's almost never just one single event or one bad leader. The real story is always way more complicated and honestly, way more interesting. So let's break down how wars actually get started. And that right there is the key. War isn't like a light switch that just flips on. It's more like a slow-burning fuse. It's this long chain of events, this buildup of tension and bad calls that eventually leads to an explosion. We're going to walk through that entire chain today. So let's be clear on what we're talking about. At its most basic level, war is what happens when the talking stops. It's that final tipping point where negotiation and diplomacy have failed, and the only option left on the table feels like violence. And honestly, that volcano metaphor is perfect. Just picture it. All those deep, underlying reasons for a conflict, that's the magma, just churning and building pressure deep underground. And the war itself, that's the final massive eruption. Okay, so what is that fuel? What's the stuff that makes up the magma inside that volcano? Well, it turns out that throughout history, it almost always boils down to a handful of really powerful drivers. You can group most causes of war into three simple, fundamental questions. First, what's mine? Second, who's right? And third, whose side are you on? At the end of the day, it's usually about fights over stuff, clashes over beliefs, or getting dragged into a fight because of who your friends are. Let's start with what's mine. This one is as old as time. Countries fight over land because it's not just dirt. It's power, it's security, it's access to trade routes and resources. I mean, a huge part of what drove Nazi Germany's aggression was the quest for Lebensraum, or living space, which led directly to the horror of World War II. And if it's not the land itself, it's what's buried underneath it. We're talking about oil, water, minerals, the stuff that powers a country's economy and military. When those things are scarce, competition gets fierce. And that competition can absolutely turn violent. Just think about how many conflicts in the Middle East have had control of oil as a central issue. So, moving beyond physical stuff, we get to our second big question. Who's right? Sometimes wars are fought over pure ideas. They're about fundamental disagreements on how society should work, who should be in charge, and what people should value. And the classic example of this is, of course, the Cold War. Just look at this divide. For nearly half a century, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in this global standoff. And it was all fueled by these two completely opposite worldviews. It was a war of ideas that, lucky for us, mostly stayed cold between the superpowers, but it sparked dozens of very hot, very real proxy wars all across the globe. Now, a very close cousin to ideology is nationalism. Look, being proud of your country is one thing, but when that pride twists into a belief that your nation is fundamentally better, superior to all others, well, that's when it gets really dangerous. That kind of us versus them thinking makes it incredibly easy for leaders to paint other countries as the enemy. All right, and that brings us to our last big question. Whose side are you on? This is all about alliances. They're supposed to be for defense, right? And I've got your back, you've got mine kind of deal. The problem is they can act like a tripwire, turning a small regional dispute into a massive world war. And World War I is the textbook example of this domino effect. It all starts with a single event, the assassination of one guy. But because of this tangled mess of alliances across Europe, it just cascaded. Austria-Hungary attacks Serbia. So Russia, Serbia's ally, gets ready to fight. Then Germany, Austria-Hungary's ally, declares war on Russia. One domino just keeps knocking over the next until the entire continent is at war. And finally, you've got the ghost of the past. Wars rarely end cleanly. Think about the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. The incredibly harsh terms forced on Germany created so much bitterness and resentment that it directly fueled the rise of the Nazis and, eventually, led straight into World War II. The problems of one war just become the fuel for the next one. Okay, so that's the fuel. We've got our territory, our ideologies, our alliances. That's the magma in the volcano. But how does it actually ignite? Let's trace the path from that quiet, simmering tension all the way to open combat. You can think about it like an escalation ladder. It starts at the bottom, pretty quietly, with some underlying friction. Then things get more serious. The conflict comes out into the open, with threats or maybe economic sanctions. And then you get the trigger event, the point of no return. After that, things move fast. Retaliation, military action, and then finally, you're at the top of the ladder. It's war. And this, right here, is probably the single most important thing to understand. That trigger event, it's not the cause of the war, it's just the match that lights the fuse. The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand didn't cause World War I. The fuel, the nationalism, the alliances, the ambitions, had been piling up for decades. The assassination was just the spark that finally set it all on fire. So this framework is super helpful for looking at wars throughout history. But what about today? I mean, we live in the 21st century. Has the very nature of war changed? And the short answer is, yeah, big time. While the fundamental reasons for war, that fight for resources, power, or ideology, are often still the same, the methods have changed dramatically. Today's front lines aren't always on a physical map. A war can be a massive cyber attack that takes down a country's power grid. It can be crippling economic sanctions that strangle a nation's ability to function. It can be fought through proxy armies in other countries, or by spreading disinformation to create chaos from within. The battlefield itself has expanded. I mean, the contrast is just stark. Where you used to need massive armies, now you might have a few special ops teams and a fleet of drones. And instead of just tanks and planes, some of the most powerful weapons today are lines of computer code or the ability to cut a country off from the global financial system. The battlefield has gone from physical land to the digital networks that run our lives. So, all of this leads to the ultimate question, doesn't it? If we understand the causes and we can see the path of escalation so clearly, why can't we just stop wars from happening? Is real, lasting global peace even possible? It's not like we don't have the tools to do it. We have diplomacy and negotiation. We have international bodies like the UN. We have peace treaties and economic partnerships that are all designed specifically to prevent conflict. On paper, it seems like we have everything we need. But here's the big complication. International relations aren't run by spreadsheets and logic. They're run by human beings. And human beings are driven by some pretty powerful, messy emotions. Things like greed, fear, ambition, and the desire for power. And all too often, those primal emotions just steamroll any logical argument for peace. And so that leaves us with this really tough final thought. We know how the volcano works. We can study the geology. We can see the ground starting to shake. We can even predict where the eruption is likely to happen. But actually stopping it? Well, that remains one of the greatest and most tragic challenges humanity has ever faced.